And just read again those first couple of verses at the beginning of that psalm. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. And we read words like that, and I wonder what your reaction is to them. It's so easy for us to project those words outwards as though they apply to someone else. You know, we stand very often and we say, look how bad they are. Look what terrible things they are doing. But where does that end? You know, often we'll have a situation where you have two people who are busy pointing out each other's faults. And it gets nowhere, does it? Other than it escalates. It really doesn't end. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And this is what I call the politics of the playground. If you've ever done playground duty at a primary school, you'll know exactly what I mean. That we're so very good at seeing what he did to me. But the sad thing is, this is how wars begin. Our nations are not run by primary school children. They are run by adults who ought to know better. And yet this is the state of our world. This everlasting escalation that goes on as a result of that attitude. And you know, I look at the church and many Christians that I interact with are busy doing exactly the same thing. This psalm speaks a number of times about the wrath of God. And so often people in the Christian church are good at pointing out the way that everybody else is subject to the wrath of God, but God loves me. We might sometimes think about God's wrath in terms of my past, but we're not very good about thinking about it in terms of our present and our future. So we project out there these ideas. At the very least, I am part of a nation, and I am ruled by a king of the earth of some kind. Now ours happens to be called a prime minister, but nevertheless he rules over me, and I've been responsible for putting him there. But better still is for us to look at these words and remember that these are principles that are manifested in me. So I ask, what do these nations and kings of the earth in me rage against? Now I could say they rage against God. And that's kind of the obvious answer, but I'm going to say it's a little bit too simplistic. It doesn't really help us get into this psalm in any way. What I'm going to say is that creation is an image of the Creator. And the Lord, we're told in the teachings of the church, is divine order itself. And what I find myself raging against are the things that stop me doing what I want to do. You see, there are laws that govern the universe, and sometimes they get in my way. I don't like what they are telling me I need to do or I need to avoid. I simply want to do whatever it is I want to do. Now, how can I know that this is true? Well, I can know that it is true by looking at the lives of people around me. You can sit in a cafe at times and watch the world go by. And you can observe what happens in people's lives and notice the frustrations and notice the things that go wrong and notice the way that they rail against everything that seems to conspire against them. And then you can realise that you're subject to exactly the same laws as they are. That there are things that stand in your way, although you often like to deny that that's the case. The thing is, this psalm also talks about a way out of this rage. And that way out is provided by the Lord. And I think it's expressed in these central verses, those central few verses in this psalm. And here is where we see this reference in particular to the Lord that makes this a messianic psalm. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. The thing about it is, the way out the Lord has provided, it's not about calling yourself a Christian. And that's a difficult one for some to understand. You know, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, he said this, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." See, it's all tied up with doing the will of the Lord. The Lord came into the world, and he did it in person, not so that we could consciously acknowledge him, but in order to reorder spiritual processes that were sending us all to hell, that we were tied up with in a way that we couldn't release ourselves. And he re-established for us the possibility of choosing a heavenly life. So I want to read for you a passage from Heavenly Secrets, Arcana Celestia. This is paragraph 2034, a section of it, reasonably long, but well worth hearing. "After everything heavenly with people perished, that is, all love to God, so that as a result the will for what is good existed no longer, the human race was separated from the divine. For nothing other than love affects conjunction. And when love has been reduced to nothing, disjunction takes place. There's a separation. And when the latter has taken place, destruction and annihilation follow. At that point, therefore, a promise was given concerning the Lord's coming into the world, who was to unite the human to the divine, and by means of this union was to join to the divine the human race that was abiding in himself through faith grounded in love and charity." So the Lord came into the world to re-establish the spiritual connection we had lost hold of. I'm going to continue. "Once faith springing from love did not remain any more in the world, the Lord came and united the human essence to the divine essence so that these were completely one, as he himself states explicitly. At the same time, he taught the way of truth to the effect that everyone who believed in him, that is, who loved him and what was his, and who abided in his love, which is a love directed towards the entire human race and so towards the neighbour, would be conjoined and thus saved." That's a really long sentence. But what I want to say is he defines what belief is. When we talk about believing in the Lord, belief is who loved him, the Lord, and what was his, and who abided in his love, which is a love directed towards the entire human race and so towards the neighbour. So there it is. There is what belief is. It's that love, putting love into practice. Once the human had been made divine and the divine made human in the Lord, an influx of the infinite or the supreme divine took place with people, which could not possibly have manifested itself in any other way. Also, by means of that influx, the dreadful false persuasions and the dreadful desires of evil were dispersed, with which the world of spirits had been filled and was constantly being filled by souls streaming in from the world. And those who were actuated by such persuasions and evil desires were cast into hell and so separated. Unless this had been done, the human race would have perished, for it is by means of spirits that the Lord rules the human race. So you have this process going on where the Lord re-establishes the connection between our world and heaven. He re-establishes the possibility of us entering the heavenly life. But note that he does not guarantee your personal entry into heaven. Now you might have noticed as we read through this psalm, reference to the rod of iron. It's found in verse 9. You shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. And they're very hard words, aren't they? Those words are quoted in Revelation chapter 2. But we also find the image of the rod of iron later in Revelation in chapters 12 and chapters 19. So it's quite a common image that is pulled out of this psalm. It stands for the power of spiritual truth within the natural. For all natural truth that has spiritual truth present within it possesses power. So there's the reconnection of the spiritual world, what is higher, with the natural world, what is lower, and the power that results from it. When we turn to consider these kings of the earth, at the beginning of this psalm, my sense of them is they are really our self-centeredness, our desire to rule our own life, our desire to have our own way. That's our king of the earth. That love, that self-focus, that worldly focus actually has a real and useful purpose, but only in its correct place. And so what happens as we move through this psalm, at the end of the psalm, we see how there's a refocusing. It's not that we lose our sense of self, it's not that we lose our love of ourself, but it is put in its proper place, in its proper order. It is made subject to spiritual principles. And anything of that self-love, that worldly focus, which does not submit to spiritual rule and spiritual principles, must be removed. And in actual fact, those out of order desires that we have actually lead to their own destruction. I wonder whether you noticed in Revelation chapter 6, I also mentioned kings of the earth. And in that sixth seal, at the end of chapter 6 in Revelation, this is what is said. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, and so on, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the rocks and mountains, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? The self-focus that would rule our world, our worldly focus, cannot stand in the presence of divine love. It calls on itself its own destruction. Now, one of the things I just want to say is that we have to realize that all religious ritual, all intellectual knowledge, these are all natural things. One of the things we tend to do is we try and look at a natural religious perspective as saving us from another natural state of life. The other day, Pam and I went and saw Sister Act the musical in the centre of town. I don't know if anybody's seen it. Based on a film that was, I don't know, it was 20 years old or something with Whoopi Goldberg in it. But there's a lovely moment in this musical where it focuses on the Mother Superior. And she is talking about the kind of sanctuary that the church provides her, the safety away from the difficult trials of the world and the evils that she sees out in the world out there. The thing is that safety inside a church is just another form of natural. It's not actually a spiritual thing. It gives people a sense of comfort. It gives people sometimes a sense of security, but it is not spiritual development. Spiritual development exists at a whole other higher level. And our real security is that spiritual development. It's interesting the way that this particular Mother Superior in the story, she prays for the salvation of the church. She prays for people to come into the church and be giving offerings so that the church can sustain itself. But of course, who are the people that come through the doors? There are all those people out there in the world who are the very people she was trying to keep out because they represented a threat to her. And you can see how two naturals can conflict with one another. Our only security and safety is to look to spiritual principles, not natural ones, even ones that speak in religious terms. And so we find at the end of the psalm, just have a listen, the way it's expressed. The way the kings submit themselves to the Lord. Now therefore be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son lest he be angry and you perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him.